Greetings, adventure. Welcome to the D20 Academy. I'm your host, Shalo Kaneshiro, and today is episode 20, Gods and Goddesses. Hey, welcome to the second episode of September. Last week was Monster Monday, focusing on the Lich, which is one of my favorite monsters in the game. If you haven't listened to that, I suggest go ahead and checking that out. It does a lot of fun making, and hopefully, you can learn something, maybe get inspired to, maybe put a Lich into your game. Today, I'm going to be talking about the main topic, which is kind of religion, gods and goddesses in Dungeons and Dragons. I've kind of split that up into three kind of sections: religion in D&D, religion in your campaign, and then the Pantheon. And then today I also have two side topics, which are kind of related to the main topic. One is role-playing religious characters, and the second is religion in world building. If you're someone who's kind of designing their own campaign setting or designing their own world, I have some kind of notes on that. If you kind of want some updates for the podcast, want to learn about the episodes that are coming out next week and other cool things, you can go ahead and follow on Instagram at D20 Academy podcast. I believe is the Instagram, and there you can kind of get updates, learn about what that week's episode's about, and all that good stuff. But without further ado, let's get into gods and goddesses. Okay, so first, we're going to be talking about kind of religion in D&D. So, Dungeons & Dragons is set in a fantasy world. Typically, of course, you can take the system and put it into like a sci-fi game or a survival game or whatever. But Dungeons & Dragons in itself is a fantasy role-playing game. So therefore, it takes place in a fantasy world, whether it's Eberron, Middle-earth, something of your own creation. And of course, these worlds are based off of our world. And so we're likely to have religion, gods, goddesses, angels, demons, all that kind of thing. That's all very wrapped up in Dungeons and Dragons. It's actually one of the reasons, kind of behind the satanic panic in the 80s. All the craziness about Dungeons and Dragons, being satanic and cultish and all that kind of stuff, was kind of because it did have in it some aspects of like angels, demons, religion, gods and goddesses. Of course, this is, I may actually do a future episode about the Satanic Panic. I'm not so sure, but of course that's all, it's a part of the game. It's a part of fantasy worlds. That's how they are. It's part of the immersion and stuff. In the typical Dungeons and Dragons world, gods and goddesses are similar to those in like Greek or Norse mythology, right? Like these powerful immortal beings who, they actively shape the lives of mortals. They're human-like in their emotions, maturity, morality, and like paintings and stuff, they're depicted looking similar to humans and such, right? So like Zeus and Hades and Poseidon, all of them, right? And kind of the ancient mythological religions of the world, they were all kind of these pantheons of gods who were very, very human-like, and maybe were like siblings or they were married, and then they could come down and maybe take human form or mess with people on the earth and kind of interact with them there. And that is what a lot of kind of like the classic D&D world religious system is based off of. A pantheon of gods, and they all kind of have their own focus and their own, specialty, and they have like followers and worshippers, and they're very similar to Greek mythology. Kind of if you read any books kind of like the Iliad or the Odyssey, which are great books, by the way. I'd suggest reading them. That talks a lot about the gods, the Greek gods, and they're like working in the lives of mortals, and how mortals have to appease the gods and how they interact with the gods, and all of that. That's very much a fantasy world trope. Forgotten Realms, Eberron. All of those worlds are, have these pantheons of these gods with all their different domains and their different alignments, more human-like, not really like super omnipotent or omniscient. And so it is kind of rare to find a D&D world, a D&D campaign setting similar to the one we live in, right? On Earth, there's multiple religions and faiths. Religion itself is questioned. No one is for sure whose gods are real, who's right and wrong. Whereas in D&D, it's much more like, these gods are definitely real. These are the only gods. there's technically only like one religion, I guess. And, we can pray to them and we know they exist and they can communicate to us and they can come in and interact with the world and such. Which is, not very much like our own world, which, has tons of different religions and belief systems with all these different kinds of gods and stuff. Religion and faith has always been a part of Dungeons and Dragons, as I said before. It's led to the typical archetype of like a devout cleric, kind of like the righteous paladin, the crazy cultist. These are all kind of Dungeons and Dragons tropes, and it's because of like the religion and faith aspect of the game. It's also like fiends, right? Demons and devils, they're also a very big part of Dungeons and Dragons, especially from Wizards of the Coast's own content, like the World of the Forgotten Realms, very much kind of fiend focused. There's lots, and there's like angels and stuff. Like if you look at the monster manual, the fattest section in the book is on demons and devils and all the different kinds of demons and devils. Maybe the only thing, maybe even that size, is maybe the section on dragons. But yeah, fiends are also a pretty big part of D&D, and also celestials, I guess. On the multiverse also, and how the planes and all that work in D&D, also have a lot to do with religion. In some campaign settings, like gods live in certain outer planes, or kind of dictate the outer planes. And I believe like the Raven Queen, I think she lives in the Shadowfell or something like that. And some of the other gods live in all these other different planes. And so kind of the multiverse and the planes themselves also have a lot to do with kind of religion and the beliefs of the characters in your world. Now, 5th edition in particular, it segregates gods into the different clerical domains, right? So if you're not aware what those are, I believe they're light, life, knowledge, thunder, like tempest, I think it's called thunder or tempest, death, and then there's, I can't recall at this moment. Nature, I think, is the other one, and trickery, I believe those are the clerical domains. So when you choose a cleric at level 1, if you're playing a cleric character, you have to choose one of those domains, and it's kind of like your subclass, kind of your focus, which is pretty cool. So in 5th edition, they separate gods by the domains that they fit into, and also their alignments, right? Lawful good, lawful evil, neutral, all that. And they do this to not only like easily organize them, but also to help characters who play clerics to have a domain and alignment that matches their god, right? So if I'll get into this in a second, but it's good for new players, especially if a new player wants to play a cleric. Obviously a big part of playing a cleric is having a god that you follow faithfully. Choosing a god that is the domain you want to play, right? Life or Tempest, and also that is the same alignment as you, is a really good way to help new players figure out their cleric character, figure out their worldview, figure out their clerical domain and all that. Now, one thing to think about is, what if the world you're playing in, the campaign setting you're playing in, what if the religion or religions are ambiguous, right? Kind of like our own, right? You don't actually know if certain religion itself is even true, or like certain religions are right or wrong. So you can have to take that into account when you're playing. A lot depends on the campaign setting you're playing, how religion works, how the gods work, if there's even gods, if there's one god, all of that. It depends on the campaign setting you're playing, obviously. Also, a thing to think about is like, what if a cleric or a religious character doesn't share a domain and alignment with their god? What does that mean? How does that work? And I'll get more into role-playing a religious character later. Now, I have mentioned this before, but I just want to mention it again, now that we're on a similar topic. What about warlock patrons? Right, so if you've looked through the Player's Handbook, or you've played some D&D, especially 5th edition, you see clerics choose gods to follow, and warlocks choose patrons. What is the difference between gods and patrons? Well, a god is a celestial being, right? Maybe they had some sort of work in creating the world, or creating a particular race, or creating a particular feature, or maybe they have a job in facilitating the world. Maybe they control the sun, make sure the sun is always moving, maybe make sure dead souls are ferried to the underworld, stuff like that. All right, gods are like Zeus, Poseidon, the Christian god, right? That's what a god is. And then a patron is just a powerful being that a warlock makes a deal with in exchange for their power. So clerics get power from their gods. They get divine power and magic from following their gods, right? They're blessed with this power. Warlocks get power from making a deal with a patron, which is a powerful being of sorts. I believe in the player's handbook, the options are the Archfey, right, which is very powerful, Fey Lord, some kind of like Eladrin or fairy king or something. The one is the Fiend, right, maybe a demon lord or a demon lady, or very powerful like pit fiend. And I think the other one is the Great Old One, which is kind of this, maybe more of like a otherworldly, incomprehensible being, maybe similar to like Cthulhu, Lovecraftian horror kind of being. And a warlock chooses a type of patron, like a particular patron, and that's the one that gave them their power. But there's a difference between the dynamic between a god and a character who follows them, and a patron and a character who made a deal with them. A character who follows a god typically does it on purpose, right? It's very rare to have a cleric who follows a god that they don't believe in, right? The god typically shares their domain and shares their alignment. The god has these tenets, these rules that they want their followers to abide by, and the cleric abides by those rules to the best of their ability, right? They're faithful priests and crusaders and such for their god. It's typically a conscious choice to follow this god. And the god blesses the character with divine power and stuff because they're doing their will and following their tenets. On the flip side, the dynamic between a patron and a character does not have to be so nice, I guess. Just because you made a pact with this patron, a deal, exchanging something of your own in exchange for power, doesn't mean you guys have to be on good terms. Doesn't mean you have to have the same alignment or focus, right? You can very much make a pact with an evil patron, an evil being, but still try to play a good character, right? And that can be a part of the character's struggle and kind of their character arc is, having to come to terms with having this power bestowed by a dark being who is constantly asking of them certain things in exchange for power and trying to be a good person. But these patrons can be of all sorts of people. No, once again, if you play a warlock, your patron cannot be a god. It can be a celestial being of sorts, like a very powerful angel, but it cannot be a god in particular. That is for clerics. Clerics follow gods. That works differently. Warlocks have to make a pact with a patron, which is just a very, very powerful being. They might be more powerful than a god, or as powerful as a god, depending on how your world works. But it doesn't have to be purposeful. It could have been accidental or as a last resort that your character made this pact. You don't have to agree with or have the same alignment as your patron. And it just creates this totally different dynamic between warlock and patron and cleric and god, right? These are very different dynamics played out very differently thematically, and also how they work mechanically in the game with spellcasting and all of that. All right, typically, I've talked about clerics before. I made a class kind of focus on them, a spotlight on the cleric, and of course I'll do on the warlock a little bit later when I kind of get down the line to the warlock class. But clerics typically also are like good, righteous people. They follow a good, righteous god of like light or life, fostering, mercy and compassion and, vanquishing the darkness. And patrons, warlock patrons, are typically maybe a little darker or more mischievous. Warlock kind of has, kind of a dark, evil connotation. But, as a warlock character, you don't have to necessarily be dark or evil. But these patrons, they may be really good. They may be really bad. It all kind of depends. But the relationship between them, this kind of exchange, this pact, is much different than someone who follows a god out of choice, and has like this moral obligation to do what's right or whatever their god asks of them. So that's kind of. I have talked about this before, I think, but I just wanted to real quick talk about the difference between gods and patrons. Okay, now I'm going to get on to religion in your campaign. So like I've mentioned before, and like I'll probably mention a couple more times, religion and the gods and all that is obviously based on your campaign setting and how it works there, right? As I've kind of mentioned, in kind of more classical Wizards of the Coast fantasy world, campaign settings, it works much like the Greek, Norse, Roman pantheons. That's kind of how the gods work and all of that. But it depends, right? I think now I haven't seen Game of Thrones. I haven't read any of the Song of Ice and Fire novels, so I'm not super familiar with the content. But I believe in Game of Thrones, the religion is, I think there's just one religion. It's called like the Seven, and they believe in like these seven different gods. But I think they're very much out of the way, right? Some people don't even know if they exist. They don't have lots of influence in the world. They can't physically interact with the world or anything. And that's a little more similar to our world right now, right? Where religion is a little more ambiguous and not as straightforward and obvious that there's certain gods or anything, right? And then in Middle-earth, right, there is this whole creation story, this beautiful story of the gods and the angels that Tolkien wrote. If you haven't read the Silmarillion, definitely reading at least the first chapter. It's a gorgeous piece of literature. Yeah, it's really amazing. Basically, in Middle-earth, it's very similar to the Christian way of the creation of the world with a singular god who, in Middle-earth is named Iluvatar or Eru, and then he has these angels, which, are called, like the Valar. Anyway, I don't want to start getting all nerdy with you about Tolkien, but yeah, so that one is much more similar to kind of the Christian story of creation and stuff. And once again, that God and those angels don't really interact with the world, as actively and stuff. So religion is a bit more ambiguous in a world like Middle-earth. So it all depends, right, on the campaign setting you guys are playing in, what you choose. Even so, you should decide as a group how relevant religion and the gods are to your campaign. I can't stress this enough, your game type and your playgroup preferences always supersede any rules or campaign setting restrictions, right? Remember that Dungeons & Dragons is an open world game, role-playing game. You do whatever you want. The way you want to play, the way you and your friends interact, how you guys want to play the game, that always supersedes any game mechanical rules and any restrictions put in the campaign setting, right? So if you're choosing to play in a certain campaign setting and you don't really like the way the pantheon is and the way religion works, change it. Do whatever you want. That's the best part of Dungeons & Dragons. It's what makes it so enticing and what makes the game so endless and infinite, with just, an infinite amount of possibilities and ways to play the game. So just remember that you should never, you and your playgroup should never feel stressed at all to have to abide by rules or restrictions set upon by the campaign setting or anything like that. You guys always talk with each other, figure out what you guys want, figure out the way that you guys play best so you can have the most fun. Okay? So real quick, just some notes for any Dungeon Masters listening. It is likely that one of your players is playing a cleric, or if you haven't started your campaign yet, is going to play a cleric, or a class similar, which, depends mechanically and thematically on following a particular god. As I talked about just a second ago, clerics do depend on following a specific god or like tight-knit group of gods. It's how they function mechanically with the class features and such, and also thematically, obviously, their character is based around this god that they follow. If you don't have someone playing like that, you might also have a player whose character is just religious. Doesn't mean they have a class which depends on this factor. They could be a rogue, a fighter, a barbarian. Doesn't matter. They have no mechanical need for following a particular god or whatever. But the characters themselves are just religious, right? Which is totally okay and should be encouraged. You don't think, you shouldn't feel like you can't play like a religious god following character just because you're not a cleric or a paladin, right? That's not how it works. Even in like the D&D world, where there's so many like clerics and priests and stuff, there's regular civilians who don't have religious duties who still can follow gods and stuff. So if you are a player and you're you're playing a character who is not a cleric or someone who mechanically needs to be following a god, I encourage you, try like make your character follow a god, make your character religious. It can be really interesting. Real quick, if you know what Critical Role is, I talk about Critical Role, somewhat often on this podcast, just because I think that show is a perfect example of so many reasons why the game is amazing, and is a really, really good example of great players, a great DM, and you can really learn a lot from watching the show. One of the interesting kind of very, very subplots is one of the characters. He's a half-elf rogue. He has no religious background or anything. He doesn't mechanically require a god for his features and all that stuff to make sense. But the character over time kind of tries to pick up this religion of a character who does play a cleric, and kind of wants to learn about the god and learn about the religion, and slowly starts to kind of gain this new worldview and gain this new faith throughout the campaign, which is a really interesting subplot. It's quite good. Once again, if you don't watch Critical Role, go watch Critical Role. It's going to be the best thing you've ever seen. So that is an example of a character who is, not mechanically required to follow a god, but just does so because the player thinks the character would benefit from it, and it helps with the character's arc and stuff. Definitely because the god that he's trying to find out about and learn about is this kind of beacon of light and compassion and mercy, and those are kind of the tenets. And the character was kind of going down this dark, depressing path. So it's a great show. That was so that's just kind of an example of playing a character who is religious but may not require it mechanically. And if you're DM, you probably have a character like that, right? Either someone who needs to be religious or someone who has chosen to be religious. So you have to figure out the god's relationship with these players, right? Once again, depends on the campaign setting, how it all works. But, figure out, do they appear in mortal form and talk to the character? Do they send messages? Do they show signs, forebodings? Do they only start caring when the character starts getting more powerful? Do they only start noticing when a character is starting to really follow their tenets and show themselves to be true heroes, or something like that? Once again, it depends on the campaign setting. I'm going to say it like 1,000 times in this episode because it really does. But just kind of think about, in the same way when one of your players is playing a warlock, you have to think about, what is the relationship with the patron? How does that work? This patron has to kind of be a character now, and you have to figure out the relationship and build stories around that and stuff. Same with the cleric. They're following a god, or any religious character, right? How does that god interact with them, if at all? How is the relationship, right? How does that all work and function? And it can be really fun for both the DM and the player. And as a DM, it can give you lots of inspiration and help you add more story hooks and adventures because of all that. Just real quick, make sure you guys talk as a DM. Make sure you talk with your playgroup about religion and its part in your game, right? Religion and faith are real things in the real world, and you want to make sure everyone is comfortable with how it is presented and used, right? If you as a player, you as a DM, if you have problems with how religion is being presented or used in your playgroup, in your campaign, make sure you voice your concerns, right? The point of Dungeons & Dragons is fun, right? Everyone should be having fun. Everyone should be enjoying themselves. And if maybe something to do with how religion or the gods or whatever, or priests or whatever are portrayed in your game is making you uncomfortable, make sure you voice your concerns so your playgroup can change things and make sure it's comfortable for everyone in the playgroup so that everyone can enjoy themselves and have fun, right? This is obviously the same with tons of other things. Make sure if something's making you uncomfortable that you can talk it out with your friends, talk it out with the people you're playing with, so that you guys can figure it out together and make sure that no one is uncomfortable or no one is getting offended or whatever. So you guys can just enjoy your game, right? Nobody else is experiencing this game except you guys, right? In the rare case that you're streaming it or putting it up on YouTube, only you guys are experiencing this thing, so you don't have to worry about the masses, any other people making fun of you or whatever, or criticizing you because maybe you were getting offended or you're feeling uncomfortable because of a thing. It's just you and your friends, so make sure you voice your concerns if something about religion or any part of your game, right, is making you uncomfortable. Just real quick wanted to explain that. And now let's get on to the pantheon. So as I've talked about before, the typical D&D campaign setting, right, Forgotten Realms, Eberron, all that, has an array of gods, right? They have names, domains, alignments, tenets, etc. So these gods make up that world's pantheon. So I've used that word a couple times here. So if you're kind of confused what that was, a pantheon is like the collection of gods in your world. So for example, like the Greek pantheon is like Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Athena, Hera, right? Like the Greek god, the ones who live on Mount Olympus and stuff. That's kind of the Greek pantheon. So most D&D campaign settings that I've explained are similar to kind of Greek, Norse, Roman mythology, and so they have a pantheon. While a lot, once again, depends on your campaign setting, here's some things to think about the pantheon. What are the relations between the gods? Is there a conflict in the pantheon? Is there multiple conflicts? How long have these conflicts been going on? How will these conflicts be resolved? How can these conflicts be resolved? Who's involved in the conflicts? Within the gods in the pantheon, are there varying power levels? Is everyone equal in power? Are some more powerful than others? Right, in the Roman one, Zeus is the king of the gods. He has the most power, and second to him are Poseidon and Hades. They also have considerable amounts of power, much more than gods like Hermes or Dionysus or something like that. Are the gods in the pantheon related? Maybe they're siblings, maybe they're spouses, maybe not at all. How does there being multiple gods affect the world? Right, so something to think about always when you're running a campaign in your D&D campaign. It doesn't matter if you have one god, multiple gods, ambiguous religions, whatever. Everything about the game, even beyond religion, even talk just any topic about the game, it all comes down to how does it impact and change the world of the characters. Right? The game follows the player characters, follows their adventures, follows their stories, their personal arcs, their friends, their enemies, their battles, their wins, their losses. So everything you think about in the game, especially religion and the gods, you have to think about it in the sense, how does this impact them? How does this impact the world that they live in? How does this impact their experiences? Because it always comes back to them. That's what the story follows. That's what D&D is about. So you always want to make sure when you're planning things, thinking about these questions, don't get off track. Don't get super deep. All you have to figure out is, think about all these. There's conflicts in the pantheon. They all have different varying power levels. These ones are married. These ones are siblings. How does this affect the world? How does this affect the party's experiences, their adventures, their stories? Okay. So this, first of all, means that as a DM, you don't have to do as much planning or as world building as you thought you might have to. But it's just, you always want to make sure that that's the forefront focus in your mind. Whenever you're planning about anything, whenever you're thinking about any part of the game, the multiverse, the gods, whatever, it's always how does it impact the world and interact with the world that the party is living in, that the party is experiencing. Now, I'll get more into designing gods into Pantheon later in the episode, but just keep these things in mind. Also, having gods look over different domains or alignments can be really useful in setting up factions and followers in the mortal world, right? So if you look at something like the Forgotten Realms, if you look at a god whose domain is maybe war, and they're lawful evil, followers of this god are typically going to be lawful evil and oriented towards battle. If you have a god who has the domain of nature and is lawful good, the characters who follow them, the NPCs, the PCs, whatever, are typically going to be lawful good, right? And focused on nature, nurturing it, protecting it, stuff like that, right? So because 5th edition has, helpfully segregated the gods and all that stuff into domain and alignment, it makes it really easy to figure out what these gods' followers are up to and what they're doing and what their goals might be, right? If you have a world with a pantheon, like the Forgotten Realms or, like the Greek pantheon, you're going to have these different groups of people who follow the different gods. And What are their goals? How do they get to those goals, right? It's very easy to figure those out by just looking at the god's domain and their alignment, right? It helps dictate the focus of the followers, how they see the world, how they'll treat people, how they treat nature, how they treat life, how they treat death is very dependent on the god's alignment and the domain. And so having those two things is very makes it much easier for a DM and a player to figure out how characters, religious characters work, and how they see the world and how they act, and all of that. Now this even goes beyond in if you're one of those playgroups who doesn't use alignment. That's totally fine. If you want to learn more about alignment and if you should use alignment or not in your campaign, I do have an episode called the Alignment Deep Dive that I recorded earlier on in the podcast. So go listen to that if you haven't already. But even if you're someone who's playing a campaign that does not use alignment, you want to still figure out some sort of way to show the morality or be able to kind of mark down the way they view the world and kind of the choices they'll make. It's just alignment is just a much easier and simple way of figuring this out. But if you don't use alignment or you don't like it, you can figure out another way to kind of help section off these gods and kind of organize them, and then also figure out what their followers do. Okay, so that was the that was the main topic there, talking about religion, gods and goddesses, in Dungeons and Dragons, in your campaign, and all that. So now we're going to get on to our first side topic, which is about role-playing a religious character. Okay, so playing a religious character in Dungeons and Dragons, it can be really fun and interesting, and is also can be really helpful in defining your character's worldview and alignment, which I've talked about, somewhat in this episode. I myself, as I've explained, I am not typically a player character. I've spent most of my Dungeons and Dragons experience as a dungeon master. I love being dungeon master. But I have played as a player character a couple times, and I have only played one character who is religious. I played a cleric named Atticus Turner, I believe, and he was I think he followed. He was more of like a lawful good character, followed a god who fosters peace, sacrifice, mercy, compassion, and it's a really fun and interesting dynamic. Kind of having this external influence on your character, and also just for new players and stuff, it's just an easy way to help define your worldview and alignment and keep your character consistent. Right, one thing that's really hard as a player in Dungeons and Dragons is playing a consistent character. Right, now this doesn't mean that you can never change or have a character arc. Of course, that's a really integral part of the game and a part of story. But you still have to play a consistent character with a consistent personality, and making choices that make sense to the character, and it can be kind of hard. It's not as easy as it sounds in a role-playing game, and in Dungeons and Dragons. But a really easy way to help you figure out how your character sees the world and how they might act is by having a god, having someone they follow who already has these laid down tenets and rules that their followers should abide by. So when you already follow a god who has all these rules or whatever, has their own worldview and this set of things that their followers should do living while in the world, then that is what you are going to want to do, and that is how you're going to see the world as a follower of that god. So as a new player, especially like a cleric who has to follow a god, that's super interesting, and that can be really helpful and help your character keep consistency. And definitely if you're playing a character who is not similar to you or does not share the same worldview or morality as you, having these kind of tenets and rules already laid down by just the god that you've chosen to follow can really help in role-playing a religious character. But once again, as I've stated 1,000 times in this episode, a lot depends on your campaign setting and how religion works. Now, I've made a list of about 20 questions that I'm going to go through real quick here that you should ask yourself, that you should find answers to if you're playing a religious character. Okay, Why are you religious? Why do you follow who you follow? Why that God and not any others? Do you agree with everything your God agrees with? Do you follow their tenets and rules completely? Do you share an alignment with your God? How do your religious beliefs shape the way you see the world? How has your religious beliefs affected your past? How do your religious beliefs affect the present? How do your religious beliefs affect the future? How high up is your God in your priorities? How high up is religion itself in your priorities? How, quote unquote, religious is your character? And that's in reference to like rites, traditions, sacrifices, prayers, those kinds of things. How much do you respect your God? How much do you respect other gods? How do you feel/react when someone disrespects your God? What would make you stop following your God? Do you push your faith onto other people? Are you more of a priest, apostle, or crusader? So those are some questions you might ask yourself when you're figuring out, a character. Definitely if you're playing a religious character, right? Specifically like someone like a cleric. Obviously, you don't have to answer all of these or whatever, but this should put some ideas in your head and pose some questions for you that if you would answer a lot of them or all of them would really help define your character's worldview and really make your character super consistent and authentic and realistic. Now, this rule applies to many things when you're playing a D&D character. Just keep asking yourself questions. Choose something about your character, the god they follow, someone in their backstory, their fighting technique or whatever, and just ask questions. Figure out questions and then answer them. Right, like the ones I've listed here. If you're someone who follows a god, and that can really just help, really get the creative juices flowing, and really just help flesh out your character and make them interesting and authentic. I do want to point out a couple key questions I want to repeat here. One of them being, do you share an alignment with your god? Now, I've talked about, right, how gods have their own domain and alignment, and typically the followers have the same domain and alignment. If you're a cleric, you do have to have the same domain as your god. Otherwise, it really doesn't make sense thematically. If you're following a god of life and your domain is death, and so you're getting these access to these death powers, and you're following a god of life, and that doesn't make sense. But you don't necessarily have to share an alignment with your god. And this kind of searches out to other questions in the list, or some questions that you may have thought of on your own while listening to the list, right? Do you agree with everything that your god agrees with, right? Do you share their same worldview, and will you do all the tenets and follow the rules that they ask you to as a follower of them, right? Because there's a big difference between being a chaotic good character that follows a lawful good god. This is a really interesting dynamic. It's a challenging one, and it's one you have to figure out as a character. But when you have a different alignment than your god, it can be really interesting, and it's kind of one of those things where you really like the gist of the god, you probably like what they're going for, and like most of what they're saying, but you don't agree with everything. And so how does that affect your character, and how does that affect their faith? So that's kind of an interesting question. Another one I wanted to point out is what would make you stop following your god? This is a really powerful and really interesting question to ask, right? If you're a cleric or like a character who follows God, what could possibly happen? You learn information, an event happens, something changes in your character that would make you stop following your god. Because once you figure this out, then you can much more, figure out why you follow that god, right? If you can figure out what would make you stop following that god, that better helps you understand why you are following that god. And if you figure out what makes you stop following that god, what could make you stop following that god, and can't really think of anything that would make you follow that god, maybe you've chosen the wrong god, or maybe you just have to think a little more, right? So I think that's a really interesting question, and it also could plant a seed in your character arc and something for your character. Maybe they're a little questioning about their god, and maybe there's still some mystery there that they don't fully agree with, and maybe when something happens or this thing happens, you might turn away from your god and stop following them, which is a really interesting character point and could be really cool. The third question I want to kind of focus in is, are you more of a priest, apostle, or crusader? So if you're not at all kind of in like religious circles or understand kind of what those words mean, a priest is more someone kind of like a pastor, someone who fosters the religion and typically like maybe like lives in the church or is always by the church, and kind of they affect other people who also follow the same religion. They help strengthen their faith. They help lead them in prayers and lead them in rituals or whatever. That's kind of like a priest. And then there's apostles. Their goal is to bring their religion to people who do not follow their religion. So priests work with people who are in the same religion. Apostles work with people who are not in the same religion, so they can spread their faith to others. And then a crusader is someone who typically fights for or goes out for and does goals and completes missions for their god, which are not goals that include getting other people to join the religion, right? That's kind of more of an apostle's job. So kind of think about maybe where does your character kind of fall. Typically, if you're a D&D adventure, you're probably falling something like a crusader, or maybe like an apostle. In the second campaign in Critical Role, once again, go watch that show if you love yourself. One of the characters named Jester. She's a follower of this mischievous god named the Traveler, and everywhere she goes, she's always trying to get people to follow the Traveler and to join her religion. She's not very good at it, but either way, she's always trying to get people to follow her god, the Traveler. So that's kind of more of an apostle character, where someone who goes out and fights for their god, right? Definitely, if like the god is like, keep the darkness away, fight demons and stuff. A crusader is a character who typically goes out and would follow this, right? Go out, fight back dark forces, fight demons and devils and stuff. And yeah. Okay, so that's kind of just some things about playing a religious character, role-playing a religious character. Some questions to think about when world building and all that. So hopefully that helped. And now I'm going to get on to the final topic, the second side topic, religion in world building. So I've talked all about how religion and the pantheon and all that depend on your campaign setting. But what if you're the one making it? So I'm kind of going to be doing these typically at the end of most of my episodes, where it makes sense. Where I'm going to be talking about, the main topic that I talked about, and then I'm going to talk about how to put it into world build, right? If you're someone who's building a world, most likely if you're a dungeon master or a D&D player who's building their own campaign setting, or maybe you just are a writer or just someone who wants to build a world, maybe you're an artist. So I want to be able to focus on these different aspects of world building as I kind of go along. And since this episode is all about religion, gods and goddesses, I'll kind of give a brief rundown of some things to think about if you are world building and how religion fits into world building. Now, religion and the pantheon should be one of the first things you consider in world building, because it is, for the most part, directly tied to the origin and history of your world. Right? Typically, the creation story of your world and how the past has been influenced and all that solely depends on your religion and your gods and all of that, right? If you look at anything like Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, all the creation of the world and all these different events in the history of the world, all are tied back to the gods and their relationships and their interaction with the universe and all of that. So religion is going to be one of the first things you want to think about because it is directly tied to the creation of your world, the origin of your world, and how it all works. It can be good also to find a religion to kind of base your own off of. Is it more of a classic pantheon like the Forgotten Realms or the Greek pantheon? Is it more monotheistic and similar to the Christian faith or that in Tolkien's Middle-earth works? Does it pull inspiration from real and fake religions and have things like reincarnation, indulgences, mortal ascension to godhood, immortality, xenophobia, all of those different things you can pull from different religions, real life or fictional, to kind of get some inspiration. Also, I've talked about kind of pantheons and stuff. Creating a lot of gods can be overwhelming and is not required, right? So one of the things I did with the first world I built that I've been playing my 2.5-year campaign in, I made kind of these like 6 primary gods and then about 10 secondary gods, and then like a gazillion like these lesser gods who were like super specific, like gods of birds and gods of coins and stuff, which I don't think I should have now thinking back on it, I made way too many gods, and it took away from kind of the experience. It made it way more confusing for the players and stuff. Having just a couple gods, or even just one, can really help simplify the religion and the world, and allow you more time to flesh out each god and their tenets. Right. So if you take something like Greek mythology, yes, there are those who live on Mount Olympus, the main Greek pantheon, but then there's actually tons of other gods, of all different kinds, lesser gods, demigods, in mythology. And don't feel stressed to have to build out all that stuff. Just build the ones on Mount Olympus, right? Zeus, Hera, Poseidon. Focus on those, flesh them out, make them interesting. And so that just makes it easier on the players, less gods to remember, and just really helps specify things and makes the story much more intriguing and interesting. Okay, so real quick, some questions to ask yourself while world building and using religion and world building. How many gods? How powerful are the gods? What are the gods' relationships with one another? What are the gods' relationship with mortals? How involved are the gods in the mortal world? How common are divine/god-induced occurrences? What domains do your gods fall under? How moral are your gods? What does it mean to be a follower of a god? What does it mean to have divine power and or spellcasting? How are the gods connected to the world's origin? Why are people in your world religious? What does it mean for people in your world to be religious? How do gods communicate with one another and or the mortal world? Can your gods die? How? Can they be resurrected? How? Did the gods create the world or certain aspects in it? Or do they run certain aspects of it? How ambiguous and mysterious are the gods to the mortal world? What is the gods' interactions with the multiverse and other planes? So once again, that was a list of about 20 questions, just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. Some things you might want to answer when designing religion and kind of the pantheon or whatever in your world and the campaign setting you are building. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I had a lot of fun making this episode, and hopefully you had a lot of fun listening to it. Hopefully you got inspired. Hopefully you learned a lot, and get excited for that next session or planning for that campaign that you've been wanting to play. Once again, for more updates and interesting stuff, you can follow the podcast at D20 Academy Podcast on Instagram, and also. I usually can't say what next week's episode is going to be, just because a lot of things are changing and I have to work, switch some things around and all that stuff to make sure I can fit these podcasts into my regular life. But I can say that next week, Tuesday, is going to be the class spotlight on the Druid. I think I've done 3 class spotlights so far in the podcast. They're a lot of fun. I talk about the class and their place in Dungeons and Dragons, kind of their origin in Dungeons and Dragons. I talk about, some of their abilities, some key features. I don't go super rules or kind of numbers intensive. That's up to you to search further. But I really focus on playing this kind of class, what kind of players would like playing this class, and all of that. It's a lot of fun to make, and I think it helps a lot of people. So next week is going to be a class spotlight on the Druid, which I'm really excited for. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.